We all know about the pirates of the Caribbean who terrorized Spanish and British trade ships in the Caribbean Sea and along the east coast of the United States. But interestingly, these pirates were a Spanish creation, brought into existence by poor planning and sloppy economic policies. Out of sight, out of mind, right? From intense rivalries fought across islands for economic power, to losing the ships transporting those economic goods to pirates you created, the Caribbean has its fair share of interesting stories. I'm Doug Sharp, and today we're going to take a dive into the waves of Caribbean history and see how it changed the landscape of our weird world. Our story starts on the island of La Hispaniola within the Colonial Zone. It was the first headquarters of Spanish powers inside the Americas, coupled with a big fortress to protect it. It was also known as the City of Firsts, being the center place of many of the first structures and systems inside the New World, like hospitals, universities, and cathedrals. This city was so influential in the New World, it became a reference for many New World town planners, with its unique checkerboard grid pattern becoming a staple in many different cities across the Americas. However, despite the economic control the Colonial Zone gave the Spanish, it did come with its fair share of trouble, especially with the other settlers beyond Santo Domingo. In the area that is now known as Haiti, there were some French hunters who had overstayed their welcome. The Spanish already had their hands full dealing with the indigenous Taínos people of the island, so they didn't appreciate the extra headache of these French hunters killing all their livestock. So they were left with only one option: kicking the French hunters off the island. To enact their plan, the Spanish went around the island and forced the already struggling French hunters to move to the island of Tortuga, thinking they'd never have to deal with them again. But when the French hunters were booted to Tortuga, they were left with very little resources to live off of, so they resorted to pillaging for survival. They specifically targeted any Spanish ships that were returning to Spain loaded with tobacco, cocoa, and silver so they could sell it off into the black market. With this incident, Tortuga became known as the birthplace of pirates, which became one of Spain's major enemies in the region. Yet, in the Caribbean trade game, pirates weren't the only up-and-coming threat to the Spanish. With the growing colonial expansion in the Americas, many European countries saw the opportunity to make money in the Caribbean, sailing out to build their own wealth. The British specifically wanted control over the economic power developing in the region. Right off the bat, the British did what the Spanish couldn't, setting up a successful trade town in Barbados which specialized in sugar, and making it a powerful launching point for their imperial power. Due to its location, the British established strong trade routes throughout the Americas, distributing resources and slaves to all of their colonies. Bridgetown became so well known that it was the only city outside of the current United States visited by George Washington, with two of his ancestors being early planters in the land. Yet, all of this was possible because Barbados had previously been occupied by the Spanish, who had wiped out most of the indigenous population and left the island mostly deserted, thinking there was nothing else they could do there, which was a blessing for the British, because they didn't have to fight the indigenous population to gain control of the island, unlike the Spanish before them. With an easy entry, the British brought over slaves to work the land, eventually founding Bridgetown and its garrison, becoming a popular and successful trade town. Still, that popularity came at a cost, as they were putting themselves out there for raids by other European countries and the more dangerous pirate groups, which, coincidentally, had also been increasing in size and power. Even so, the military forts of Bridgetown held strong against enemy raids, giving the British a strong foothold in the Caribbean, allowing them to expand their trade routes and become a major power in the region, to the point where they could start to challenge their global competitor, the Spanish. However, they didn't rush to fight the Spanish. The British knew if they went after the Spanish, they would eventually be overtaken by the pirates, no matter if they won the battle or not, and the Spanish also knew this. So the Spanish and the British formed an unspoken temporary truce, not attacking one another and trading with one another, while fortifying their ports to defend against the pirates. Now, to get an idea of what the British and Spanish were defending against, let's take a look at some of the most interesting pirates that terrorized the Caribbean. Remember when the Spanish sent a group of French hunters to the island of Tortuga? Well, this group of hunters turned pirates ended up becoming a real thorn in the Spanish's side, turning Tortuga into a small pirate fort from where they could launch their attacks. Since the island of Tortuga is just to the west of La Hispaniola, it had the benefit of being in the middle of many of the Caribbean's trade routes. This meant the buccaneers could easily intercept most of the Spanish's trade ships, further aiding in their quest for survival and revenge. United by a common enemy, this merry band of thieves named themselves the Brethren of the Coast, developing their own code of conduct and way of life, accepting all those who needed a place to stay and were willing to plunder. This pirate fraternity attracted many would-be buccaneers from other countries as well, including England, Holland, and Portugal, just about anybody who wasn't Spanish. Even though most of them received privateer commissions from England and France, most of them described themselves as buccaneers, which came from the French word for curing meat, boucanier. Considering the small island they started from, the buccaneers grew into a considerable force, spreading throughout the Caribbean, but they weren't as big as this next group. The Republic of Pirates in Nassau, Bahamas was well known as a pirate rest stop, where famous pirates like Blackbeard, Sam Bellamy, and Stede Bonnet met, and it was a good place to cash out on any loot plundered from the sea. Since Nassau was tucked away further from the rest of the Caribbean islands, it allowed the pirates to sit down with each other and make plans on how to fight back against the rest of the European powers. Even though Nassau's location provided some relief to the pirates, calling it a rest stop might be a bit of a stretch, since the French and the Spanish attacked the town any chance they had. Even so, the fighting for the island did stop the British from reclaiming Nassau for a little while. All the pirates had to do was not fight with each other. To make sure this didn't happen, every pirate in Nassau was bound together by the Pirates' Code, which stated that each crew under the Republic would vote to decide on who would be the captain of their own ship, while also agreeing not to attack any other pirate crews during their stay. To further ensure the code would be followed, the pirates elected magistrates, which was very similar to the British before them, who would ensure the rules were being followed and that the pirates who came in got along. One of these magistrates ended up creating such a large name for himself that his terror and influence is still talked about today. A man known for the color of his beard and the warship he captained. This magistrate's name was Blackbeard, the most feared pirate in all of the seas. Blackbeard was revered for the presence he held over the Indies and the Caribbean, sailing across the world to plunder any trade ships he came across, becoming a feared name across all of the seas. His signature ship, Queen Anne's Revenge, was mounted with more than 40 cannons and over 300 bloodthirsty men, striking terror into the hearts of all those who laid eyes upon the ship. However, Blackbeard didn't gain his feared reputation by lighting fuses in his beard or carrying around 6 pistols, but rather as a privateer, basically a military contractor, hired by the British to fight against the French and the Spanish in Queen Anne's War. Despite having shown great leadership and fighting capabilities in the war, the British Royal Army tossed him aside right after the war ended. While Blackbeard sailed the seas, his crew spotted the French slave ship La Concorde, which was full of sailors sick from scurvy and dysentery. This allowed Blackbeard to take over the ship, renaming it Queen Anne's Revenge. Filled with spite for being tossed aside by the British after the war, Blackbeard built up his crew, spread his name, and terrorized nearly every part of the Caribbean and the Indies. But pirates have a short lifespan. After Blackbeard raided and blockaded the port of Charleston in South Carolina, the British had had enough and began hunting Blackbeard. But they knew that would be expensive and time-intensive, so they offered Blackbeard a royal pardon, which would wipe away all of his crimes so long as he left the pirate life behind. And Blackbeard did accept the royal pardon, giving up the pirate life and settling in North Carolina as a civilian. But after a few months on shore, to support the lavish lifestyle he had become accustomed to, Blackbeard returned to being a pirate. And Blackbeard was once again a very successful pirate. And soon, the people living in the American colonies were tired of their ships being attacked. And the governor of Virginia asked the British Navy to finally kill Blackbeard, which they finally did in an early morning battle off the coast of North Carolina. It's said Blackbeard suffered over 20 sword wounds and 5 gunshots before he finally died. Needing proof of Blackbeard's death to collect the bounty, British Lieutenant Robert Maynard cut off Blackbeard's head and hung it from the front of their ship as they sailed home. Now let's get back to the Spanish, who had been setting up another island while the British were dealing with the pirates. After watching all the pirate wars going on in the Caribbean and America, the Spanish were terrified of losing another great point of trade, Cuba. So the Spanish imposed massive trade restrictions on Cuba, preventing them from trading with anyone the Spanish didn't approve of, which were mainly the pirates and other European countries. Unfortunately for Spain, this massively backfired. The trade restrictions ended up making Cuba almost exclusively trade with pirates and the British, in backroom black market deals. Realizing the great economic potential of Cuba, the British began developing a plan to attack the Spanish positions on the island and take over its main port city of Havana. Havana was the Spanish's ticket to further greatness in the New World after failing in Barbados. Not only that, since Cuba's location was right in the middle of many active trade routes, they benefited from getting all the pass-by traffic that came into their ports, which the British wanted a piece of. This desire culminated into a war, where the British captured Havana and proceeded to bomb the rest of the city until they surrendered. Seeing their favorite port blasted to smithereens, the Spanish made an agreement with the British, giving them Florida so they could keep Havana, or at least what was left with it. Despite Havana's location being a hotspot for trade routes, the British were more than happy to trade it for Florida, since it gave them a chance to expand their footprint in America, while also keeping an eye on Nassau, which they wanted to take back later. Still feeling the pangs of defeat, the Spanish spent a huge amount of money in building the fort of San Carlos of the Cabin, locally known as La Cabaña. This fortress was so big that by the time it was finished in 1774, it became the second largest colonial military installation in the New World. With the new fortifications, Havana fared well against any future threats, albeit at a huge cost to the Spanish crown. But this wouldn't be the last headache the Spanish had to deal with. Just like Havana, the harbor of San Juan in Puerto Rico became an important harbor town, and a starting point for many more Spanish expeditions, furthering their influence in the New World. Also, just like Havana, the influx of trade routes had attracted many unfavorable foes, like our friends the pirates and the British. But the Spanish had learned from their previous mistakes, and immediately got to work building multiple fortresses without waiting for anyone to attack them first. The main fortress they built, called La Fortaleza, along with a smaller one called El Cañuelo, served as a cross-defense towards the sea. With this technique, any pirate, British, or Dutch ship would fall victim to a volley of cannonballs, making the port an impenetrable fortress. But even with this overwhelming defense, the Spanish decided it wasn't enough. The kings of Spain ordered an even bigger fort than the one they had built in Cuba, one they named El Morro. This fort was under construction for over 250 years, and ended up reaching 6 stories tall, filled to the brim with cannons, vantage points, and everything else you'd want in a fort. Just the imposing stature of El Morro was enough to scare away any enemy ships that saw it. But really, by the time the fort was finished in 1790, the threat of pirates was long gone, and the British had their hands full at home with their tense political situation after having lost control of America. Now, the Spanish sat by their lonesome. They had full control over the Caribbean and no one to oppose them. So in the end, they finally got what they wanted. Until 1865, when the Dominican Republic, home of the Colonial Zone, their first establishment in the New World, gained their independence. This was a big blow for Spain, but it was only the start of them losing their control over the Caribbean. San Juan, along with its fortress, was taken over by the US during the Spanish-American War of 1898, and more Caribbean countries began claiming their independence from Spain, further severing the Spanish from the influence they held over the region. Soon enough, Spain, along with Britain, became parts of the Caribbean's history, and a relic of a bygone era.